Welcome to Coaching Uncaged by Animas, the podcast that explores the art, science, and career of coaching. And now, introducing your host and interviewer, Yannick Jacob.
Guthrie Sayen, it is my absolute pleasure to have you here on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Yannick. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, people who've been listening to this podcast know I don't like reading bios. Yours reads just wonderfully, just because the humanness and the authenticity, the sense of mission and purpose really sticks out. So there's not a lot I found on your kind of previous career. So I'm really curious about how you found your way into all of this. But you're leading the IFS Institute's co-created the IFS Institute's coaching workshop, and for ages I wanted to get Dick Schwartz on the podcast. It's been difficult to get a hold of him, as you can imagine. But we're a transformative coaching school, and the potential of IFS to transform people, I find absolutely enormous. I know very few people who have been left untouched after they've explored the internal family systems framework, parts work, multiplicity. We'll explore a little bit further what that means. But I just found it fascinating when coaches, particularly, but anybody really, comes in touch with what IFS is about. The potential for transformation is enormous. So I'm really was looking forward to have somebody with experience in coaching on the podcast, because Dick Schwartz is not a coach, right? The founder of Internal Family Systems. So it's been really important to me that I get to talk to someone who's been applying this in coaching. And you've been running your own training programs, coaching with Spirit in IFS. You've been teaching a lot. So I think you're an ideal person to explore the IFS framework in coaching with. This is ICF accredited. You had over 1,000 people on the IFS Institute's Coaching for Self-Leadership program. Your mission is to create a college of light workers to end human suffering. I thought that was absolutely amazing. And I can see why IFS plays into that. So you seem to be quite a spiritual person. Every time I talk to you, I slow down. Even now that I mentioned it, it's difficult not to resonate with you. So I'm sure there's a lot more that we could say about you and where you're from. Please, by all means, tell us a little bit about what we may have missed or what might be important to know in terms of where you're speaking from, how you found your way into IFS or working with Spirit. And anything that might be needing to add to this introduction. So I stop waffling now and hand over. Guthrie, so good to have you.
Thank you, Yannick. IFS has changed me and changed how I see the world. I found it was a perfect match for my own spiritual orientation. And I've been training coaches in IFS since 2013. And the trainings themselves transform the coaches, who then go out and transform their clients. It is a very powerful model. And it fits my own spiritual orientation. So as you've noticed, Spirit is central to what I do. I've created a coach training school accredited by the ICF called Coaching with Spirit. And my website is called Bridge to the Divine. And to provide a little context, what that means is that I think coaches become more empowered when they realize they're connected to something bigger, and that something bigger is actually holding them and their clients, and that they can actually relax into that something bigger. And when they do that, they become more of who they are. And when they become more of who they are, they're of greater service to their clients. And the coach and the client both have more fun. That's the first sketch at your answer. That's your question.
Yeah, and it comes back to that a lot as coaches develop and mature. In the beginning, there's technique that we learn or processes, just holding space for people. It's not just holding space for people. People learn coaching techniques and interventions. And then as coaches mature more and more, I find they find their way to themselves, because coaching as a relational practice means that we need to be in touch with who we are. Only then can we come in relation, in true relation with another. So this also seems to be very much one of your premises. We need to be able to know who we are, ourselves, or in the IFS framework, more ourselves, and plural.
So in the Coaching with Spirit model, which I created, I say there are three aspects to coaching. There's the being, the relating, and the doing. And the being is the foundation for relating. Who we are has a tremendous impact on the coach-client relationship. So the more we can access self with a capital S, and we'll talk more about that, the more we can be fully present and open and ready to relate to our clients. So that coach-client relationship is foundational, because everything that we do, the doing aspect, is supported by the relationship. So I've noticed the same trend as you, Yannick. When we first learn coaching, we focus more on the doing. But the more deeply we go into it, we find that being is first, relating is second, and doing is third.
Yeah, and I always love that about Animas and any coaching training that put being closer to the start of it. I think it's okay to learn some processes, but I think very early in the journey, it's important we learn about humanistic approaches, person-centered approaches, being to being approaches, holding space, being with someone. I mean, that's the foundation of a lot of coaching. And I think as AI is coming in, a lot of the processes will be done possibly better by an AI. But the being with, that's so human. That's very difficult to replace.
Yeah, I like to say presence trumps technique. But technique is important. Learning skills, learning strategies, and practicing them until they reside in our deep memory is important, because then we trust our being more when we know the skills are available to us. So it's both and, but ultimately presence is more effective than any technique.
Yeah, and I love that about IFS, and I'm sure we get more into it as we move along, that it started for me, I got to know it as a technique. And then I realized it's so much more. It becomes a way of life. It becomes a philosophy, a way to approach communication, approach other people, approach self-reflection, awareness. So I found that fascinating.
Yeah, it's really a model of how the world works and how we can be in the world. So I like to say that IFS has 4 dimensions. It's a map of the human psyche. It's a method for working with the human psyche. It becomes a way of life for those who practice it. And ultimately, it becomes a program for changing the world. And let me add one thing about the program for changing the world. The key idea, which we can talk more about, Yannick, of IFS, is the idea that we are self with a capital S. And I think of self as our enlightened core. And the more access that you and I have with self, the more coherent our energetic field becomes. And coherence dissolves dissonance, but dissonance generates more dissonance. So even though I may be committed to some aspect of social justice, if I do it from a place of anger, like this must be fixed and it must be fixed now, I'm actually creating a dissonant field that is going to have the opposite effect, no matter how lofty my values.
Mm-hmm.
So first, we have to become a coherent field, access self, our enlightened core, before we act.
Hmm.
That's how it can become a program to change the world, is to realize who we are, coming back to being, who we are is how we change the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where we come back to, well, we work with people to awaken or to find a way to themselves so that then they can do that for other people. And I always saw that in coaching, regardless of whether it's IFS or not, is that we help people be more in touch with themselves and understand their relationship with themselves and with other people, so that then the people around them, their relationships around them, their communities, their workplaces, and ultimately, yes, there's an impact on the world as a whole, hugely generative, meaningful impact of the work.
I am constantly being changed by my clients.
Hmm.
They are teaching, my clients are always teaching me about the mystery of the human system. And so I'm learning about their systems, but they're also teaching me about my own system.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm changed by them. I was at an IFS training, and it was a room full of therapists, and the trainer at that moment was a therapist, and he said, the reason we become therapists is because we need 30 hours of therapy a week.
Hmm.
So I think the reason we become coaches is because this is our route to healing and awakening.
Hmm.
So let me add another sentence or two to that. IFS is a psycho-spiritual model, which means that it focuses on our psychology, or in other words, our woundedness, our humanity, and it helps us to heal the wounds of the past. But it's also spiritual. It opens us up to our true nature and to our connection to the universe at large through accessing self with a capital S. And so that's the spiritual aspect. So it helps us to heal the wounds of the past, but also to wake up to this wonderful experience, though painful at times, of being human.
Hmm.
And to our true divine nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to explore the human Guthrie a little bit more before we dive into IFS a little bit more. Couple of steps back. I mean, have you always been a spiritual person? How did you find your way into coaching in the first place? I'm assuming you didn't start with IFS, but that's an assumption.
I didn't. When I look back over my life, I can see that one of the through lines has been seeking. I would say, Yannick, that most of my life I felt disoriented, lost, almost as if I did not belong here. And I can remember as a boy standing outside a movie theater and thinking that if I could just turn around fast enough, I would see that all of this is fake. It doesn't really exist. And so I've often wondered what is true.
Hmm.
And when I applied to university, there was a question on one of the applications that said, what is your likely major? What will you specialize in? And I wrote down psychology. And when I got to university, I immediately signed up for a psychology course. And it was probably the worst course I took that semester.
How come?
It just because the teacher, the professor he had no gift for transmitting ideas or enthusiasm for the subject.
Unfortunate.
And it killed my interest. So I ended up majoring in literature. And behind me is a wall of poetry, which is one of my hobbies. And I minored in art history. But there was always this interest in why are we the way we are? And so I, like many coaches, I experimented with different spiritual paths. And I would try them for a while and they wouldn't really seem to work for me. And I'd kind of give up. And then I would get interested again with a different path and try that for a while. I think, and then this might be a landmark event in my life. I got involved with something called the Mankind Project, which is an international brotherhood of men devoted to helping men step into emotional maturity and lives of service. And they have a weekend, an initiation weekend, that is based on the hero's journey as described by Joseph Campbell.
Mm-hmm.
And so that journey's got three parts. They take you out of ordinary reality. You go through an ordeal. And then you're prepared to return to the world to share the gifts you received during that ordeal. And to keep the work alive, they have something called integration groups, or known as I groups. And in I groups, there was peer facilitation. So we would facilitate each other in our transformation. And I became fascinated with this. And I became one of the trainers of peer facilitation for the organization.
I can smell the coaching already.
And that led me to coaching.
Uh-huh.
That led me to coaching. And so I was a university professor. I taught history at the University of Connecticut. And I was on a 3-year contract at the time. And I realized I needed to make a change. And so in December, I resigned before the end of my contract. And in 2006, I got trained as a coach and opened my coaching practice. And I knew I had found my calling, but I still needed to dial it in. I was wondering, so what is my soul's purpose? How can there's a particular group of people I'm designed to serve. And so I met a guy called Tim Kelly, who's created something called the True Purpose Process. And the process involves getting those parts of us that protect us, that kind of are invested in the status quo, to soften back so that we can open up a connection with our guides. And so during the summer of 2009, I spent every day connecting to my guides and refining my soul's purpose. And that was a turning point for me. I had read an interview with a photographer who often shot pictures in war zones. And he was asked, how can you do that? Doesn't it just scare the hell out of you? And he said, when I'm behind the camera, I'm fearless. I'm invulnerable. When I discovered my soul's purpose, I was behind the camera. I called up the people who trained me. I called up the head of the coaching school and said, I am now ready to be your coach. It gave me that kind of confidence. I now knew who I was and what my mission was on this planet.
It's really quite a powerful thing once we connect with that. We pick up the phone, we do what's necessary to make it happen.
Yes. I can tell you how I got the answers I got if you want, if you think that would serve your audience.
Yes, please.
Okay. So in Tim Kelly's method, purpose is divided into 4 aspects. There's a being aspect. It's who you are, even when you're doing nothing. It's what you radiate into the world when you kind of begin to polish the soot off your individual diamond.
Mm-hmm.
And so my essence statement is, and you'll recognize it, I am the bridge to the divine. So you can see why we might not know this information, because it sounds too big.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you do learn this information about yourself, if it's really true, there's a sense of humility. There's a sense of joy, but there's also some fear. Oh, really? So that's my essence statement. I am a bridge to the divine. And then there's what we call a blessing statement. And this is what is of most interest to coaches. This is what coaches want. It is the process that they do that is unique to them, that helps others transform. Mm-hmm. It's part of their own healing. Indeed, their wounding is their training to do their purpose. And so my blessing statement, which describes the process I do to help my clients transform, or the people who come to my coaching school, is I bring wounded healers, and that describes a lot of coaches. I bring wounded healers into the temple of love so they can heal the world. So that's one way I create the College of Lightworkers that you referenced earlier. And then we each have a mission, and that's a larger project that calls on your essence and your blessing to make a change in the world. And so my mission statement is, I am here to end suffering on the planet. Or to put it another way, so that's one way I received it from the guides. The other way is, I am here to bring the light of love to the planet.
Profound.
That's my mission statement. And so my strategic goal is to create a college of light workers to partner with me in bringing the light of love to the planet. And then the fourth aspect is your message. What is your message for the world? And mine is, love yourself, and you can love the whole world. It's like you need to learn to be compassionate to yourself before you can be truly compassionate to others without burning out. And I was working with a client and helping her to refine her purpose statements. And I said, so your mission statement is XYZ. And she said, yeah, that's what it is, but it doesn't sound right when you say it.
Huh.
Which was interesting. So I said, okay, you say it. And she said it. And I said, how does that sound? She says, it sounds just right. So I said to her, say my message, because we were working on message, I now remember. I said, say my message. And she said it. And I said, yeah, I see what you mean. It doesn't sound right when you say it. But when I say it, it sounds like I'm on true north.
Gotcha.
So it's interesting. Words are energy packets. And when they're lined up with who we are, it feels right in our system.
Mm-hmm.
And so when there are great teachers and then the students come along and they try to give the same message the teacher gave in exactly the same way, it's not going to be nearly as effective. A really good teacher creates students who then go off and find their own voices.
Yeah, you gotta create it yourself. I mean, that's part of the essence of coaching, that I can't just give this to you. I can't just put the words into your mouth. It needs to come from you.
Yeah. So once I found my purpose, I had a compass. I was never lost in a coaching session. I just need to bring them into the temple of love. And how does that fit with IFS? The temple of love is access to self with a capital S. And so IFS blends very nicely with my personal process of transformation.
Yeah, this is great. Because what came up for me just now is that sounds somewhat like, that sounds like a guide. It sounds like someone who can help you get there, right? And I have experienced IFS as the practitioner takes a lot of, like, it's not directive as such, because the client still chooses what to work on and where they want to go. But the practitioner takes someone by the hand. There's a lot of guidance in the approach. And that makes a lot of sense coming from that position. So I'd love to dive into IFS a little bit more, and maybe discussing that right now might be a bit too early, but like, can we put a frame? You already described IFS as multiple selves. We already understand the four kind of levels of what it can be and where it can lead. What else could we say about IFS so that someone who's never heard of it gets a better understanding of what it entails?
Okay, so IFS synthesizes 3 models in a way. That's what makes it unique. So the first idea is multiplicity. And that's the idea that the human psyche naturally subdivides into parts, that we have subpersonalities, that those voices you hear in your head saying, oh, let's go to the party, oh, let's stay home and watch Netflix, those are parts of us. And so multiplicity, or parts, are natural, normal, and actually beneficial. Parts are actually resources for us. And so that big idea that we have many parts also has a corollary in IFS. And that corollary is all parts are good. There are no bad parts. So even if you have a part that is deeply critical of you, or to be extreme, even if you have a part that tells you you should kill yourself, if we get to know that part and understand it from its perspective, you will find out its noble intention. So just as you and I have a noble purpose, and I found my purpose that summer of 2009, each of our parts also has a positive intention, a noble purpose for the whole system. So
let me just jump in there, Guthrie, because that's it's such a profound shift in how we relate to ourselves, because every coach will resonate with either having those voices themselves, maybe not the ones to tell you kill yourself, but the ones that are really harsh, the ones that are that really don't seem to like us at all, the ones that are in the way, they're sabotaging ourselves, they're just don't seem to be good for us, and we don't like them and we don't appreciate them. And to create this shift of getting curious about, how is this part trying to help me? How is this behavior of mine serving me? It's such a powerful question for coaches, that you don't need to do IFS to ask, how is this serving you? But once we make that shift in relating to these parts in this way, it creates so much value for us. It creates so much compassion and love.
As we say in the United States, it's a game changer. It changes everything. And it is a truly radical idea. And there are coaching models that pay lip service to the idea that we are naturally good and whole. And yet they still subtly are trying to get rid of parts of us, like the inner critic. But in IFS, all parts are good. There are only bad roles, and parts can change. And you cannot get rid of a part any more than you can get rid of energy. And so the object is to befriend our parts and learn their secret histories. And so that inner critic is simply trying to improve our performance and to keep us safe. It's trying to help us, if we get to know it, to avoid humiliation, for example, or to finally win my father's love or my mother's love that was never offered unconditionally.
There's different categories of parts. Could you say a bit more so that people get a bit of understanding for the model?
Yeah. So the first big division is you could think of a circle, and that circle is the universe of parts. And there are innumerable parts. We don't know how many. And we could divide that circle vertically in half. So now we have 2 equal hemispheres. And this is just a schema. It isn't exact. And on one side of that circle are the parts that are at choice. In other words, they don't carry burdens of extreme roles or distressing emotions like shame or terror. So they're free, and we're pretty much unaware of those parts because they don't cause us any problems. In the other hemisphere of this circle are the parts that are no longer at choice. Their behavior is governed by their burdens of pain or by their extreme roles, like the critic who's actually trying to protect us. And those are the parts we're interested in because those are the parts that cause conflict and trouble inside us. So that's the population of parts that we focus on when we're actually doing IFS. Now, if you can stick with me here, we're now going to divide that hemisphere of parts that are not at choice in half. And above the line are the protectors. These are the parts that are trying to control the internal and external worlds to keep us safe. And if they fail, other protectors come in and try to distract us from the pain. So those are the protectors. And then below that line in that same hemisphere, in the lower quadrant, are the exiles. And the exiles, for the most part, are young parts of us. Very young sometimes. They could even be a fetus, an infant, a toddler, but children, adolescents, sometimes young adults. These are young parts of us that have been wounded, that have been hurt, and they carry burdens of shame, terror, grief, difficult emotions, and they have limiting beliefs. They believe things like, I'm unlovable and I'm unworthy, or I'll never amount to anything, or I'd be better off dead. They carry thoughts like that. And so you can see why the protectors don't want those parts to be activated, because they make us feel terrible.
Mm-hmm.
So we might have a protector who's an achiever, always does our homework on time and gets good grades in schools, so that we won't feel the part of us that feels unworthy or incompetent. And if that striving doesn't work, maybe we have a distracting part that gets us to go smoke marijuana behind the school and distract us from that pain.
Mm-hmm.
So the protectors and the exiles are the parts that get our attention when we're doing IFS.
Right. What I always found fascinating about IFS is that this is not just an intellectual model of how the psyche is structured. These are actual parts that we can talk to, and that the process often involves creating that kind of conversation. Sometimes often I found in quite a meditative state. But yes. I found it fascinating that you can ask or invite a part, like a manager, a protector, to have a conversation, that inner critic, right? I think every coach will have explored to some extent facilitating a conversation between you and that critic of yours, right? There's a voice attached to it, or there seems to be a personality to it. So parts work really takes this to the highest level and invites that part in. And then you can ask parts that are in the way of you having that conversation to maybe wait outside in the hallway, and really treat them as if there are people living inside of you. So could you say a bit more about the process of facilitating these kind of conversations?
So whether you believe parts are real or not, if you treat them like people, the method works. Mm-hmm. So you treat them with respect and dignity. You befriend them. You see them from their perspective. So earlier, Yannick, you were talking about how relational coaching is. And as we mature as coaches, we realize that, wow, it's really all in the relationship and how I'm showing up in that relationship. IFS is a deeply relational model. And what it does is it sets up a relationship between the client's self and the parts. So this might be the moment where I introduce the idea of self and then come back to the parts. Does that sound good to you?
Mm-hmm.
So I said earlier that IFS has three big ideas, and each of those ideas has a corollary. So one big idea is multiplicity. We have many parts. And the corollary is all parts are good. And this is truly radical. All parts are good, despite their roles. There are no bad parts, only bad roles. So who do parts yearn to be in relationship with? They yearn to be in relationship with the natural leader of the internal system. And in the IFS model, and also in my own model, Coaching with Spirit, we call that the you that is not a part self with a capital S.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the second big idea that IFS synthesizes. And for me, it's the crowning idea.
Hmm.
And all the spiritual traditions, in a sense, they're esoteric paths. They're paths to peace and compassion and enlightenment. They're all about accessing self with a capital S. Even Buddhism, no self, that simply means in IFS terms, no parts, just access to self. And access to self, Dick Schwartz has discovered, and this is one of the great discoveries of IFS, Yannick, is that we can access it more easily than we might imagine. That this awake, aware consciousness inside us is actually more available than we realize. And we just need a critical mass. That is a homeopathic dose, just enough to get a taste of self.
Mm.
Now, one way that we remember self in IFS is that it is characterized by 8 qualities, all that begin with the letter C. So I'm going to list those.
Mm-hmm.
So the cool thing about self is that when our parts soften back and let us have just a smidgen of access to self, these qualities naturally emerge. We don't have to build these qualities. They pre-exist.
Just need to access them.
We have access to self, we have access to these 8 qualities.
Mm-hmm.
So one of those qualities is calmness. So the inner peace you're looking for, you don't need to cultivate it, you simply need to access it.
Mm-hmm.
Another is clarity. We see more clearly. We see without the distortion of, say, our inner critic. We see without the distortion of that wounded child who thinks he's unworthy or she's unworthy of love. A third quality is confidence. We don't need to build confidence. We don't need to build resources, which is what a lot of therapeutic models do. They're aimed at building resources in a client. We simply need to access the confidence that's already there. So just imagine as a coach, if you had access to calm, clarity, and confidence.
I think most coaches will have had an experience of being in a coaching session and the client accesses that state and all of a sudden they're calm and it's clear to them what they need to do and they're so confident about their next steps. It just happens. What a beautiful moment. And in IFS terms, that's when they access self with a capital S.
Yeah, so coach and client are in that moment both accessing self.
Mm-hmm.
That relationship of self to self then becomes self-amplifying.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, the coach can do less and less. The more access the client has to self, the less the coach needs to do, because then the system, the client system, becomes self-guiding.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's the role of the coach to manage the parts. I'm not sure if that's the right language, but to help the client access that self.
So to connect back to what started us on this, when the client has access to self, the coach can then facilitate a conversation between the client with a critical mass of self and the client's parts.
Mm-hmm.
And that helps when the client's parts begin to experience the client's self, they begin to relax.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that
then allows the client to have more access to self and to become a resource to the parts.
Yeah, right.
So it's a wonderful ecosystem because the parts are resources for self, and self is a resource for parts.
Mm-hmm.
So we could think of it as an orchestra with self as the conductor. So, and the parts as the musicians. So without parts, no sound, no music. Without self, no harmony.
Chaos.
Chaos.
Yeah.
So they're resources for each other. It's a beautiful ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that self starts building relationships and starts having these conversations. But we have a couple of C's missing, right? So calm, clear, confident.
And so then the next two I'm going to mention really are the bread and butter of any coach. One is curiosity. And we always want to bring beginner's mind, curiosity, to whatever's happening in ourselves and inside our clients. A great Zen teacher said something like, a beginner's mind is filled with possibilities. In an expert's mind, there are few. Something like that. So curiosity, and then compassion is the ability to hold the space for suffering. Self can hold the space for the suffering of the parts. It can hold the space for the inner critic. It can hold the space for that exile that feels unworthy of love. So for me, compassion is the keystone C quality. And it's what all spiritual practice, it's the fruit of all the spiritual practices. Compassion for self, compassion for others. There's creativity. So you've probably said to the coaches that you've trained, coach the client, not the problem. When you hold the IFS model in your mind, even if you're not using the individual steps of the model, if you realize that one of the emergent qualities of self is creativity, all you have to do is help the client access self. They will create all the solutions to their problems because they have natural access to creativity. Self is also naturally courageous. It can stand up in the face of opposition and threat. It can stand up in the face of fear. And so while self is kind and compassionate, self can also be fierce.
Courageous.
Yes, courageous. So if you think of the sign of the Tao, the two different, the circle, black and white, one yin, one yang. Self has all the qualities of the feminine, the receptive, the tender, but it also has the qualities, the masculine virtues too, the fierceness, the direction, the clarity.
Yeah. I think I read
both.
I think I read a quote on your website somewhere that you aim to create spaces where people can take, and I'm paraphrasing, can take the necessary risks for foundational change. And that courage really speaks to it. It's not necessarily a safe space that people enter because it can be very uncomfortable to have these conversations or to meet some of these parts that we have previously tried to push down or try to kill off or send away or suppress. To meet them with compassion, it's a courageous act.
Yes. I like to say that vulnerability and empowerment are living in the same house, and they're separated by a very thin wall. And there's a doorway between them. Because when we embrace our vulnerability, we were talking earlier about our humanity and our woundedness. When we embrace our full humanity, which includes our woundedness, our insecurity, that is an empowering step. And so, yes, to do this deep kind of work that you and I love to do, Yannick. It requires creating safe spaces where people can take risks. It requires creating spaces of deep intimacy where people are willing to reveal what they've been hiding from the world.
Mhm.
And what they discover when they do that is that the room, or what I like to call the circle of learning and love, falls in love with them. And it creates space for them to do likewise, to reveal what they've been hiding from the world, and then to feel the love in the room, and to feel the power that they now have access to in their own system. So we finish up on the C words?
Yeah, that connection is there, and that I think it's already in there. We haven't named it as such, but that self with a capital S seems to want to connect and connects with ease, even to really uncomfortable others.
Yannick, I'm getting a chill. You are really tuned into this stuff. So yes, self naturally connects. And that's what we try to set up in my trainings, is so that can happen. Because when there's connection, there's access to self. And when you've got a room full of people who are beginning to access self, it becomes self-amplifying. And so the final C word is, did I get them all? I think maybe we got them all. We did creativity, connection, and courage. Yeah, you got it with connection. Thank you.
Sorry, I had to chuckle at the C word. But yeah, I mean, how many coaching clients, they're not looking to heal deep-seated trauma. They're not looking to not kill themselves or have self-critics that are so starched that they're suffering every day and they're in a deep hole. Most coaching clients, they struggle with connecting to people, or maybe even the classic, oh, I'm looking for a promotion and I'm not sure how to navigate the organizational environment. You know, these are all connections. What's holding me back from picking up the phone and calling this person that could make something happen that I desire? You know, there's something in the way. We're not doing it. It's not available to us for some reason. And if we find or help our clients find access to the self that naturally wants to connect and is courageous and curious and all of these wonderful C words, you know, then at that point we can lean back and just allow this person to do that. So what I wanted to explore a little bit, because this is what I've seen whenever I've seen IFS in practice, is there is this guidance. The practitioner in those I've seen, maybe there's others who do it differently, but there seems to be a practitioner that leads this process. Thank that part. Invite that part to wait outside. Talk to which part is coming up. Invite them into a conversation. What would you want to ask that part? What are you curious about? Now thank that part. You know, so that seems to be like, wow, I'm like, okay. So there's a lot of responsibility that the practitioner seems to take by taking someone by the hand and facilitating this access to self with a capital S.
Yeah. I love the way you're framing this, Yannick. So I said there are three big ideas: multiplicity, the second one being self. Multiplicity is one. The second is self, and that each of these ideas has a corollary. And the corollary to the centrality of self is all coaching. The meta agenda of all coaching is access to self. And it doesn't matter whether you're working in a corporate setting or you're working with someone who wants to do healing of deep trauma work. What they all want is access to self, because then they have access to their own arsenal of internal resources. So you can use this model to work at any level, with any population, in any setting.
Hmm.
You set it at the comfort level for the client. And that's one way we keep it safe, is we work at the client's comfort level.
Right. So tell us more, because most coaches who are listening to this probably regard coaching as a non-directive, facilitative practice. And with what you've said already, IFS is very much facilitative. There's a facilitation of access to self, but the way I've seen it done seems to be quite directive. There seems to be the practitioner, the coach seems to be a very active part at getting this person there.
Yes.
And guiding them to it.
So the less access a client has, and certainly at the beginning of a relationship or at the beginning of a session, they may not have as much access, the more guidance is required from the coach. But as the client gains access to self, it requires less and less guidance.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
And in fact, the system begins to take over. So I like to think of what the coach holds the structure. The coach is like the banks of the river. And sometimes the coach just has to hold the bank as the river makes a turn as it meanders toward the ocean. Nonetheless, even with a client that doesn't have a lot of access, a good coach is economical with their interventions.
What do you mean by that?
It means that the coach really doesn't need to do a lot of talking or redirecting. So let's say I was working with you and I said, it sounds like your inner critic's really been bothering you based on what you were just telling me. I mean, I'm just making this up as I go. Would you like to get to know that part of you? You say yes. And I say, okay. Where do you sense that voice in or around your body? And then I just wait for you to find it. And I might say, what do you notice about it? You see how short my questions are? What do you notice about it? And I just wait for you to go and get the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then I might say, how are you feeling toward that one?
Yeah, I love that question. It comes up a lot. How are you feeling towards that part?
That is the magic question. It does about 3 things at once. Yeah.
Yeah. How old is that part is also a fantastic question, I've heard.
That can help you decide whether you're working with an exile or a protector.
Mm-hmm.
How old is that part?
Yeah.
Does that part know how old you are? That's a good question too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I find it fascinating how often there's such a clear sense for an answer. And I always wondered, is that like a part of, like when I did first time, I was taken through parts work. I was asking myself quite often, am I just making this up? Because I know, or I have learned, somebody told me that there's a sense of an answer, but I'm just creating dialogue in my head, really.
Yeah.
Is that real? And does it matter?
Yeah, so I just say, just treat it like it's real. And I can tell the difference. They're not making it up. So, I mean, I have thought, am I making this up or is it there? But you just go with it and it has good outcomes.
Yeah, and that's what we judge it by, I guess, in the end. I mean, it's another question I've had. What if there's a client who's quite skeptical about this, or a client who never really considered that they might have multiple parts? And when you ask that part of you, that critical part of you, can we talk to that part for a moment? And they're like, what are you talking about? It's me. how do you work with that? Or how do you navigate that?
So one way you can say is, if you're willing to trust me, I can prove that that's not you. So you gotta have a lot of access to your own self to have the confidence to say that.
Yeah. How do you do
Give me the
that?
chance. I can prove that the part of you that's talking right now is not you.
How do you prove that?
That chance. So let's say you said, Guthrie, this is me. I don't have any self. This is me. And I say, well, will you give me a chance to prove it? Let's say you say yes. I say, okay. I'd say, so you're the part of Yannick that thinks you're Yannick. Is that right? And you go, yes. And I say, tell me about how you run Yannick's life? And it begins to talk to me. But you see, the whole time I'm referring to Yannick in the third person. So I'm creating the idea for the self that's listening in the background that there's some kind of separation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I talk to this one that believes it is you, but is actually a part. And then I say, is it okay if I talk to Yannick now?
That must be quite the moment.
Yeah. So then I say, Yannick, did you hear that conversation? And often the client says, yes.
Mm-hmm.
That moment, we've opened up a little sliver.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes there's two basic methods in IFS, and one of them is called direct access. Sometimes with a client like that, you have to do direct access for many sessions before you can begin to get the unblending and to facilitate the client self in conversation with the client's parts. You have to be the self in the system for the client, talking directly to the part and building trust with the part.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be very patient and persistent.
Mm-hmm. Qualities
of self, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, peace. What would you say to someone who might say, well, isn't that just actively fragmenting your client's psyche? And might that not be dangerous if someone aspires to have this authentic sense of coherent self and all of a sudden you actively take that apart?
So, I have a personal rule of thumb that I developed over time, which is to educate the client to exactly the degree they need to be educated. In other words, to do what therapists call psychoeducation, but only to the degree that they need it. Now, with some clients who are highly rational and often with high IQs and advanced education, you have to do more education. Whereas with others, you get a client who knows nothing about IFS. They come in and they say, Guthrie, I want to have a difficult conversation with my boss. And I just say back to them, it sounds like there's a part of you that wants to talk to your boss. And it sounds like there's another part of you that's reluctant to do that. Have I got that right? Inevitably say yes. I say, which of those two parts would you like to talk to first?
And
they
they're
don't
in
know
it.
Anything. All I've said is parts.
Yeah.
But they already naturally know what that means in most cases.
Yeah.
Part of the brilliance of Dick Schwartz is that he didn't convert this language into some kind of psycho speak, that these are schemas or ego states or something. He just used the language of his clients. There's a part of me that causes me to binge. Then there's a part of me that shames me after I binged. And when he discovered self, he said, wow, what's that? That seems different than all your parts. And they said, oh, that's my true self.
Mm-hmm.
So we called it self.
Mm-hmm.
So we kept the language really simple. And you don't need to know the theory as a client to benefit from this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, Two big questions left. I know we've probably just over the hour, but I think they're really important. So I do want to still ask. One is that I found that it's possible to go very deep into the psyche very quickly. That you can really open someone up incredibly fast. Some NLP techniques, for example, have a similar quality to them. And I get a bit concerned when we equip coaches with possibly relatively little training and relatively little work that they have done on themselves, perhaps, with such powerful tools.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit and how we might, what's important so that we do this safely.
Well, first of all, the coach needs to do their own work and have an inner experience of this work. And they need to understand that every human has a slightly different pacing and a slightly different internal landscape. And when you enter another human's internal system, you're entering a foreign country. And you don't know the customs, you don't know the laws, you don't know the practices, and you need to take time to learn them. So in IFS, you do that by getting to know the protectors, because they are the ones that set the rules. And you do not go to the exiles without the permission of the protectors. So let's say I was working with you, Yannick, and there was this young part that was right on the surface. And I would just say, let that one know that we're here and we're coming back to it. Mm-hmm. First, we have to talk to other parts first. And then I would say, Yannick, ask inside, are there any parts of you that have concerns about our going to the 3-year-old? And someone might speak up. And so we talk to that one and we get to know it. And we only go to the 3-year-old when that one and any other relevant protectors have given permission. Mm-hmm. So one way we keep this process safe is to only go through the gate that the gatekeeper themselves opens. So the protectors are gatekeepers and they have veto power. I have said to protectors, if you don't want us to go there, we won't. I was doing a demo once and it was early in the demo. And the protector said, well, we can't go there. And I said, fine, we won't go. And the protector said, you mean you'll stop right now? I said, yes. We will not go through the gate unless you open it. And the protector said, well, let's talk. And so we talked about the conditions under which the protector actually had a sense that maybe something good could happen, because parts also have self. Sorry to blow your audience's mind when we're a little over time. So we worked with that protector, we got permission, and we safely went to the exile. Mm-hmm. Even if we're in a follow-up session and the protector and the exile is right at the surface, we still don't go directly without checking to the protectors, because maybe a different protector from the last session has a concern this session. Mm-hmm. So it's always with permission that we go. And then sometimes, Yannick, after I've done deep work with a client, particularly in front of the room, because the work goes deeper when you've got an audience. You've probably noticed that yourself. I'll predict the possibility of a backlash. I'll say, we have done some very deep and vulnerable work. After this session, if there are parts that are upset with you having done this work, particularly if it was in front of a group, please know that that is normal. email me immediately and we'll set up a touch-in call.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think I'll leave that there because it's clear that there is such a respect for the work and for the depth that this work can reach. And that leads quite well into my other question, which is often the biggest question. It's a question that runs through my whole coaching career. What makes this coaching and when does therapy begin? Because every time I've seen IFS at work, how could you tell these apart? Because it can be very deep, very vulnerable, very therapeutic, very transformative. So where do you see the line, or is that even important to you?
I would challenge you and others to stretch your understanding of what coaching is. I think coaching has a purpose at this time in the course of human affairs, and that there are people who don't want to go to therapists. And coaches, I believe, the ones who really go deep into this work and do their own work, they've become the new shamans of the 21st century. I call my website Bridge to the Divine, Healing and Awakening. And I think coaches can facilitate healing, and that the IFS model has come at a time that allows coaches to do that. So IFS is a personal development model. It helps us to grow as human beings. And it can be used by psychotherapists. It can be used by coaches. It can be used by spiritual directors, mediators, anyone in any of the helping or healing professions. It's a way of understanding how we humans work. And yeah. And what I noticed so I've done many IFS trainings. When I first met Dick Schwartz, I made sure I spent a week with him every year for about 8 years. And so I got to know him. And early on in my knowing Dick, I said, coaches learn this faster than therapists. He said, yeah. And the reason coaches learn the IFS model faster than therapists is because they don't have to unlearn deficit models that see us as broken and injured.
They already believe that the client is resourceful.
Yeah, that the client is really naturally resourceful, creative, and whole. And so IFS in some ways shares more with coaching models than it does with some of the therapy models.
Yeah, I can see that. I remain somewhat concerned, not about you or the people that you train, is my feeling, but the coaches who learn the skill set of facilitating or entering a client system, but haven't quite done the work to resist the urge to influence the system in a way that they see is right, but really offering that process to the client.
Yeah, so
it's a big responsibility to be inside the client system and having the power to influence, facilitate conversations.
It is a sacred deal. I mean, it is that we are allowed inside someone's system, and we have to treat it with respect. And I think it's up to people like you and me, Yannick, to make sure that the people we train do this respectfully. The problem you're talking about is not limited to coaches.
Of course, yeah.
I can tell you, I have had quite a few clients who have worked with therapists who were not respectful.
Mm-hmm.
And they've come to me to recover.
Mm.
So it's up to the trainers to make sure that people don't misuse this ability. But I've also found that systems are pretty self-protective, and if you've got someone who's bungling, the system just closes. It doesn't let the bungler in.
Yeah, the protectors will step in.
Yeah.
Likely, yeah.
I find when I sit down with someone, if I've got a supercritical massive self, their system begins to open before I do anything. I can tell how a demo is going to go before we even start.
Right.
Because I can sense how our systems have begun to sync up.
Mm.
And if they've begun to sync up, I actually play with that a little bit and amplify it. And we all relax and we know it's going fine. Yeah. And I can tell if someone doesn't want to connect.
Yeah. Last question, really. That brings up the question for me of regulation. Do you think IFS would benefit or might be in need of some regulation so that we can make it more likely that the people who practice it are the people, I have the qualities that you describe? Because therapists go through many, many years of training, mandatory therapy for themselves, mandatory placement, mandatory supervision, mandatory licensing, to make it more likely that there's less bad apples, less disrespectful people who are practicing. And in coaching, or if you have a mediator coming in or a consultant, or, someone might, with the best intentions, create some harm in a client system. So I wonder what you think about regulation.
I haven't thought about it. Regulating is really tricky business because you can ossify or make rigid a system. Mm-hmm. And the ICF, the International Coaching Federation, they're in the business of regulation. The IFS Institute, as it's now called, is also interested in regulation. The model itself can't be regulated. It is a living entity. And when you come into relationship with it, it teaches you. I think we need to teach people to be deeply respectful and just to hold whatever they're doing. This is sacred work. And that's what I hold in my trainings, and it's contagious because they feel how sacred it is. And I watch the coaches I've trained work, and they're deeply respectful. Mm-hmm. I have now trained hundreds and hundreds of coaches since 2013 in this, and I watch them work, and I don't know, it brings joy into my heart because it's so deeply respectful. The approach itself is healing. Mm. It comes back to, remember at the very beginning, we were talking about presence. Mm-hmm. Comes back to presence. Is this person grounded, aligned? Is their heart open?
Guthrie, I'm being present with the time because it's passed quite quickly, and I also want to be respectful of your time because you've been giving it generously, and I really appreciate that. Any message to coaches out there? Anything that you would want coaches to know or invite them to?
Well, one message I'd like to give is that I'm leading a training starting in July. And if anyone wants to find more about that or more about me, they can go to my website, which is bridgetothedivine.com, bridgetothedivine.com. And divine is spelled D-I-V-I-N-E. And I've just made some changes to the website. So if you use the contact form and you don't hear back from me by, say, Monday or Tuesday, email me again, because it should be fixed by then. But
so we're recording this in 2023, and it's currently May. I know people will probably listen to this for years to come. You do run these trainings regularly, so if you don't catch this as it's published, just visit the website anyway, reach out to Guthrie. There'll be training opportunities. I can definitely recommend it. I haven't done one of your trainings, but I felt I'd just done one. So yeah. I can only imagine how valuable that is. So Guthrie, thank you so much for your time and generosity and presence. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's probably been our longest one on this podcast while I'm hosting. I just, how could you stop this? But everything has to end at some point. This will end now. So just lots of gratitude for you and your work. And I really appreciate your mission and the clarity of your mission as well. I think it's deeply inspiring. So thank you.
I want to thank you for the clarity and the curiosity and the connecting of your questions.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Take care, Yannick.
And you. Thank you, Guthrie. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. To watch these episodes on video, make sure you also check out youtube.com/animascoaching. See you back here soon.